Well, we all know artificial intelligence, otherwise known as AI, is here and it's only getting bigger. Now, many of us are afraid of it, but I think it could hold the key to cracking the many mysteries that still plague modern medicine. Tonight, I want to look at one such example. Research out of the University of Sydney has discovered that AI could unlock crucial insights into how multiple sclerosis progresses in those living with the condition. So for more, let's bring in Dr. Julia Morahan, and she's the head of research at MS Australia. Good evening, Julia.
Good evening.
Now, this is exciting. How can AI help treat MS?
Yeah, well, this week we've been talking about some new funding from MS Australia for new ideas in MS research. And the project that we're talking about here is using artificial intelligence, AI, to develop a pipeline essentially to derive more information from MRI scans and provide that information to doctors in real time. So MRI scans are used extensively for MS diagnosis and management, and it's essentially hoped that this technology will allow us to improve these processes and consequently improve clinical decision making.
Okay, so really what you're saying is the AI can do so much more than even just a very good radiologist looking at these MRIs.
Yes, and much more quickly. So the information can be delivered back to the neurologist or the treating doctor during the appointment, and then the decision-making process is sped up immensely, which is incredibly important in MS.
Well, let's take a step back. Can you explain to the listeners exactly what, I mean, everyone's heard of MS, but what is it and how does it present in the body?
Yeah, so MS is a disease essentially where the immune system attacks the coating called myelin around the nerve fibres in the brain and the spinal cord. So everybody's MS is different, and depending on the part of the brain or the spinal cord that is attacked, symptoms are different for everyone. So, for example, if you had an attack on your optic nerve, then you might have visual disturbances. But if it was a different sort of part of the brain or spinal cord, you might get other symptoms. So that can range from fatigue or pain, visual disturbances, trouble with walking, or balance. So it's essentially anything that's controlled by the brain or spinal cord that can be disturbed.
And there's different types as well, in that some is relapsing and remitting, but others can be just chronically progressive. What are the different types?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So there's essentially one called relapsing remitting MS, which is one where the symptoms come and go, and that's the more common form. And then there's progressive MS, and so that is the one where you have symptoms often from the beginning. We call that primary progressive MS. And people accumulate symptoms and disability over time without those periods of remission. Are they caused by different processes? So they are and they aren't. So we know the people that have the relapsing forms of MS after a certain period of time, many years, quite often will move into the progressive phase of the disease. And once you're in that progressive phase, it's less about the immune system and the attack on the body and more about nerve damage to the actual nerve fibres within the brain and spinal cord. So the underlying processes kind of change and become more difficult to treat because we're no longer talking about
Once a diagnosis has been made, what treatments are offered to people, and is there a different treatment for the relapsing remitting as opposed to the chronic progressive one?
So we're very lucky in Australia to have a number of treatments for relapsing forms of MS, and all of those treatments are immunosuppressants. So they quieten down the immune system and stop the attack from happening in the first place. If you are in the progressive phase of the disease, we do still quite often offer immunosuppressants to keep the immune system quiet, but what we're missing is the treatment to repair the nerve damage that occurs in those more advanced stages of the disease. So that's kind of where we really want to head to with the research.
And is MS increasing in the community, or is it a pretty stable condition?
No, so it's increasing. We released a report, MS Australia released a report in February of this year on the prevalence of MS in Australia, so the number of people that are living with MS, and it showed that the number is increasing, but also the rate is increasing. So the number of people that are diagnosed with MS is accelerating. So this is obviously very concerning, and we've also commissioned some further research to look at how this is working more closely.
Any thoughts as to why this is happening?
So I think the rate of increase, the speed of that means that it is mostly going to be an environmental factor change, because the genetics move so slowly, the change in genetics moves so slowly that it can't really be a genetic factor. So it must be something to do with the environment or circumstances or behavioural risk factors. So that's where we're focusing our efforts now.
And any idea, possible hints as to what environmental factor it may be?
We're not sure yet. We do know that there are a number of risk factors around MS that include smoking and low vitamin D and less sunlight and other different factors. So it might be one of the pieces of the puzzle that we're already aware of changing, or it might be something new.
Because it was my understanding that there was more MS, as you say, in areas where they weren't as exposed to the sun. So it goes from say, if you look at Tasmania, going up to northern Queensland.
Yes, exactly. So we call that the latitude gradient, and we think that's due to either vitamin D or something else with sunlight mediating through the immune system to change somebody's susceptibility to developing MS.
But this is something that's always puzzled me, that why is it that heat can then exacerbate an episode?
Yes, it's very, very difficult to know. I don't think it's necessarily related to the sunlight heat, but we also know that in some people cold can exacerbate symptoms as well. And I think it's all part of the kind of unique picture that people have of their own MS. So they have different triggers and different pieces of symptoms that all form their own kind of version of MS, and it can be different for everybody.
And do you think that the research money spent on MS in this country is adequate?
Well, I think MS is still a puzzle in many ways, and we still have a gap, as I mentioned, where we are unable to repair the damage and adequately treat progressive forms of MS. So I would always say that there is more room for attention and more research in this space.
Well, what you've told us tonight's pretty mind-blowing, and I think it's great that we're getting the extra help from techniques such as AI, and also you've given us a great insight into MS. So, Julia, thank you so much for your time and being on Healthy Living tonight.
Thank you so much.